This is the Switch 2 and this is the Switch OLED. And the question is, which one is better? And should you make the upgrade to the Switch 2 if you already own an OLED? Let's take a look at both and see which one is best, but more importantly, which one is best for you. So the Switch OLED model has been out for a couple of years now, and the jump from the standard Switch to the OLED was a really big one, especially when you use the console in handheld mode. But with the Switch 2 that recently launched, they have changed a couple of things. But is the difference between the OLED and the Switch 2 really that big? And it honestly begs the question of if you should upgrade to the Switch 2 from the OLED, especially right now, since there really isn't a ton of Switch 2 only games on the market. But let's take a look at what makes them different, what the performance has been like in games and in handheld mode, and then you can decide whether it's time to make the switch, no pun intended, or if the OLED is still good enough. So let's start with the elephant in the room, and no, I don't mean the size difference, I actually mean the screen difference. You see, one thing I really wanted from the Switch 2 was an OLED screen, and I know a lot of other people did as well. And yes, we should have probably known that they won't be able to sell an OLED Switch 2 in a few years if they launched with one. But yes, the Switch 2 only has an LCD panel instead of an OLED panel, but honestly, it is a good looking LCD panel. Let's not talk about the actual performance of it. So this time around, it is a 7.9 inch instead of the 7-inch display that you get on the OLED. And the size difference is actually really welcomed. I do enjoy the larger screen. It also makes the console feel slightly more comfortable compared to the OLED Switch, as you aren't as crammed in with the Joy-Cons. But I honestly like the slimmer bezels on the OLED more compared to the larger bezels on the Switch 2. It is something that I said back in the day as well with my Switch versus Switch OLED video, and I wish they just stuck with these smaller bezels, but there's probably some reason for them, like the magnets on the side or whatever it is. But yes, I'm not a massive fan of those massive bezels. Now, like I said, the LCD panel on the Switch 2 actually looks really good. It is much closer to the OLED than I thought it would be, but the OLED is still slightly better, and I would still love an OLED display. But this time they also went with a 1080p display with 120 Hz refresh rate. So overall, massive upgrades on the screen apart from the OLED part, and of course response time, but we will probably get one in a few years anyway. Then we can all finally play on OLED again. And yes, OLED burn-in is a risk we all take, but I think over the years now we have seen that if you use your OLED displays normally and you don't leave them stationary on the display with the same image for hours on end, the risk is lower, but there will always be that risk, and with LCD you really don't need to worry about that all that much. Now, moving on from the screen, the Switch 2 has also slightly changed its design while staying relatively consistent as well. First is the new all black design with this really nice coating, and if you haven't touched a Switch 2 yet, do it. Trust me, it really feels nice. But then it still has the classic Joy-Con red and blue, slightly hidden away below the joysticks and on the sides. And I do actually like this color scheme more than I thought I would initially, and having these sort of subtle pops of color for me is a bit more classy compared to what it used to look like. And I know it isn't just me, I know a lot of people actually prefer this all black design, but you know, to each their own. If you like this more compared to that, it really doesn't actually matter. Now, it is of course bigger as well, which does make it feel slightly more comfortable to hold just because of the size. But because it is heavier while staying the same thickness, I have felt fatigue quicker in my hands compared to the OLED. But that is usually still only after like a few hours for me, but your mileage may differ, so just sort of wanted to mention that as well. Then the biggest change in design is probably with the magnetic detachable Joy-Cons, which feels super satisfying to attach and detach, which once again, once you have done it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you haven't yet, find one and do it. You'll thank me later. Then you also still have the full width kickstand like on the OLED, which was honestly one of the biggest upgrades Nintendo made apart from the OLED display. But this time they hollowed it out, so you really only have this sort of thin bar compared to the full stand, which does make it easier to break probably. But honestly, it feels good. It is rigid enough to place it in any different angles that you might have it, and it's still as good as on the OLED. So overall, still a good upgrade. Then at the top, you also now have the addition of a USB-C port, which actually is meant for accessories, but it actually does come in handy when charging in handheld mode, as it feels less awkward having the cable inserted at the top compared to at the bottom. Then in terms of performance, the Switch 2 beats the OLED hands down in every single configuration of the Switch, from handheld to being docked. I would say the biggest difference is probably in docked mode, where the Switch 2 can now output up to 4K and the OLED can only do 1080p. And even if you take a look at how older Switch games look on the Switch 2, they look sharper, and of course they run better, as they now run in higher frame rates for most of them. Then in handheld mode, you really do still see a massive upgrade in performance, and it is really clear in games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, where they run significantly smoother with higher frame rates. And honestly, if you haven't played either of those on the Switch 2, you really get the best possible experience for them. So it is worth trying them on the Switch 2 if you haven't played them on the original Switch. And if you've played them on the original Switch, it really is worth the replay, as they just both run so much better. Overall, the performance on the Switch 2 is miles ahead of the Switch OLED, and yes, even though the OLED has held up fairly well over the last couple of years in terms of the display, performance, and overall feel, the Switch 2 honestly is just way more powerful, and running games on the Switch 2 just feels better. Now, as they say, what goes up must come down, and in the case of the Switch 2, the performance went up and unfortunately battery life went down. This of course is nothing weird, and honestly it's just the way things go. You have a console now that pushes out more frames, a screen that is 1080p with HDR, so naturally the battery life won't be as good as on the original Switch or as on the Switch OLED. Now, do I wish that they went with a bigger battery? Yes, but that could have of course led to other problems like increased weight or size. So without truly 100% understanding everything that went into the design of this console, I would assume that they sort of discussed everything and this is sort of the best option in terms of performance versus battery life. But yes, it does still suck a bit. So just for context, the OLED Switch over here had a battery life ranging between 5 to 9 hours depending on what you did. And for me, I used it a lot for traveling, especially long international flights. But now with the Switch 2, you get between 2 and 6 hours, which is drastically less. And while this is still pretty good for a handheld, it does make this less ideal for traveling, especially for those really long flights, train rides, or whatever else you use your handheld console for. So in conclusion, if you have an old Switch or if you don't have a Switch at all, then yes, it is a massive upgrade, and just take the punch and buy the Switch 2. It will be slightly more expensive compared to an OLED, but you will be getting a console that will be relevant for much longer compared to it. But if you have a Switch OLED, then in my opinion, it might still be worthwhile waiting a bit. You see, although the OLED is a few years old at this point, it is still a really good console, and it has actually held up really nicely. The screen looks amazing, it feels really good to play, and although it doesn't run games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom as well as it does on the Switch 2, they really are still playable, and you really are only losing out on Mario Kart World, which although fun, you could still play in a year or two. Now, once more Switch 2 only games drop, it will honestly be more beneficial to buy a Switch 2 over the Switch OLED. And yes, I know some of you will either want to wait for a special edition Switch 2 or an OLED Switch 2 before making the buy. And if you are one of those waiting, honestly, you aren't missing out on much yet. So keep waiting and keep enjoying your Switch OLED if you have one, or just keep waiting before you actually buy a Switch at all. And then for those of you like myself that just want to buy a Switch 2 now, don't let people shame you, spend your money and buy the console that you want. If it makes you happy and you can afford it, then do it. But on that note, until next time, cheers.